Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to have you here because we really need to talk about what's happening right now. Every 24 hours, millions of barrels of crude oil float through this channel of water in the Middle East. It's so narrow that, on a clear day, you can literally almost see across it.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. And today, that channel is, well, it's practically an active war zone. And the fallout from that single geographical choke point is rapidly rewriting India's entire diplomatic playbook. I mean, it's spiking the cost of your electricity bill and pushing the global economy to the absolute brink.
It really is. It's a profound realization. We tend to view the world in these neat little silos, right? Like diplomacy is over here, domestic energy is over there, and social infrastructure is somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, totally separate boxes.
Exactly. But when you look closely at the mechanics of these systems, you realize they are all just bleeding into one another.
Which is exactly why we are here today. For you, the listener, we have this really dense, fascinating stack of 10 current affairs notes from today, June 13th, 2026. And the mission for today's deep dive is to basically shortcut your way to being profoundly well-informed.
That's the goal.
We're going to extract the core insights and connect the dots between these seemingly disparate events. Whether you're prepping for a high-stakes meeting or studying for an exam or just insanely curious, these 10 issues will fundamentally shape the world you walk into tomorrow.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We'll start in those turbulent waters of the Strait of Hormuz, investigate a tragic aviation mystery, navigate complex domestic borders, unpack a massive shift in rural employment, and track the Prime Minister to France.
And setting the stage with that narrow channel of water in the Middle East is crucial because the geopolitical situation there is deteriorating rapidly. The Ministry of External Affairs just issued a highly unusual statement.
Right. The MEA statement from June 12th and 13th regarding the U.S. attacks on ships carrying Indian seafarers, they actually used the word unacceptable.
They did.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because using the word unacceptable against a strategic partner like the United States is a massive departure from standard diplomatic speak.
It's huge.
Usually it's we express deep concern or we urge restraint. Calling it unacceptable is like publicly calling out your best friend at a crowded party. It means the private whispers in the hallway completely failed, and the stakes are simply too high to stay polite.
Right.
But I have to ask, is this just diplomatic theater for a domestic audience?
What's fascinating here is that it is far more than theater. To understand why India is deploying such sharp language, we have to look at the mechanical failure of diplomacy in the Gulf right now. India is desperately trying to maintain its policy of strategic autonomy.
Right, trying to walk the tightrope.
Exactly. But look at the context. Back on April 8th of this year, there was a fragile U.S.-Iran ceasefire, and it essentially collapsed.
It fell apart completely.
Yeah, it has been repeatedly violated by what the U.S. frames as self-defense strikes. Currently, the Strait of Hormuz is operating under this bizarre partial reopening. Iran is granting very selective permissions for tanker traffic, but the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports has not been lifted at all.
So it's a complete stalemate.
Throw in Israel's capture of Beaufort Castle in Lebanon on June 1st and their ongoing ground operations, and the entire region's security architecture has just fragmented.
And India is caught right in the crossfire of that fragmentation.
In a very literal sense, this is the multi-alignment challenge playing out in real time. I mean, India is deeply integrated with the U.S. economy and their defense apparatus. Yet New Delhi actually summoned the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires for a formal démarche.
And for the listener, a démarche is not just a polite memo, right?
No, not at all. It is a very stern, official diplomatic protest delivered face-to-face. India is also escalating this to the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. But here is the crazy part. At the exact same moment they are protesting American military actions, India is being formally invited to join the 40-nation Hormuz Security Coalition led by the UK and France.
That's wild. So they are protesting the West's actions while simultaneously being courted to join the West's security umbrella.
Exactly. It's a massive contradiction.
That perfectly captures the tightrope of strategic autonomy. But let's bring this down to the ground level, because for you listening, this isn't some abstract international relations theory. This hits your wallet directly.
Oh, absolutely.
Brent crude is currently sitting at over $115 a barrel specifically because of this disruption. India's oil import bill, just for April 2026, hit an agonizing $18.6 billion.
It's staggering.
We're talking about a maritime artery that carries 40% of India's crude oil and 80% of its liquefied petroleum gas, its LPG. If that artery is severed, the Indian economy goes into shock.
Beyond the macroeconomic shock, there is a severe human element driving the MEA's forceful language. India supplies a massive portion of the world's maritime labor force.
All right, the seafarers.
Yes, around 240,000 Indian seafarers are working globally, and a huge concentration of them crew the very tankers navigating this contested zone.
So they are literally on the front lines.
They are. Let's look at the mechanics of maritime insurance for a second. When a waterway becomes a conflict zone, marine insurers like Lloyd's of London place it in the highest risk listed areas category.
Okay, and what does that actually mean for the ships?
It means the war risk insurance premiums for ships entering the Gulf have skyrocketed by 400 to 500% since February.
Wait, 400 to 500%?
Yes. But the sailors don't see that money. They are simply doing their jobs, sailing massive, highly combustible floating bombs into an active, militarized blockade.
That is terrifying.
The domestic pressure on the Indian government from the families of these 240,000 seafarers and from the broader shipping industry is immense.
That vulnerability in our global shipping arteries shows how instantly human lives and vital supply chains can be disrupted by a single point of failure. And that same terrifying concept of a single point of failure is exactly what investigators are confronting right now, looking at the skies here at home.
It is.
We just passed the chilling one-year anniversary of the Air India flight AI-171 crash.
June 12, 2025. It remains a deeply traumatic event for the aviation industry and the nation. A Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner went down in Ahmedabad, claiming 260 lives.
Yeah.
At the one-year mark, the public understandably expects definitive answers.
But the answers we have so far only raise more terrifying questions. I mean, the preliminary report gave us a central detail that is hard to shake. The fuel control switches for both of the aircraft's engines moved to the cutoff position just 30 seconds after takeoff. 30 seconds into the climb, the engines were completely starved of fuel and shut down. So the question that has been agonizing investigators for 12 months is, was this a technical ghost in the machine? Was it human error in a high-stress moment? Or was it something intentional?
Unraveling that specific question requires an unprecedented level of international collaboration. The Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, the AAIB, released an interim statement on the anniversary noting significant progress. But the final report has been pushed back to September 2026.
Why such a long delay?
To understand the delay, we need to look at the underlying framework of global aviation investigations, specifically ICAO Annex 13.
Okay, let's delve into that. Why does a specific international annex dictate how a domestic crash is investigated?
Under the Convention on International Civil Aviation, Annex 13 sets a universal standard. The core philosophy of this annex is that the sole objective of the investigation is the prevention of future accidents and incidents.
Oh, so it's not about finding out who to sue?
Exactly. It is not to apportion blame or liability. If investigators operated like criminal prosecutors, pilots and engineers would just invoke their right to remain silent, and systemic flaws would never be discovered.
That makes total sense.
Because this was an American-designed Boeing aircraft equipped with GE Aerospace engines, the GE X-1B models, the investigation must be a joint effort. You have India's AAIB leading, but they're working side by side with the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, alongside technical experts from Boeing, GE Aerospace, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, and the UK's AAIB, given the flight's London destination.
So reverse engineering a disaster of this magnitude requires aligning a half a dozen massive bureaucracies and engineering firms.
And requiring microscopic analysis. GE Aerospace is conducting extensive component and failure mode analysis on those engines, but the scrutiny is really heavily focused on the physical architecture of the Boeing 787's cockpit.
The cockpit itself.
Yeah, aviation safety experts have pointed to a specific design quirk regarding the fuel control switch, the FCS. On the Dreamliner, these switches are located on the center console, right between the captain and the first officer.
Which seems standard, but I imagine placement is everything in an emergency.
Placement and ergonomics are everything. Previous non-fatal incidents logged in the Aviation Safety Reporting System have flagged that these specific switches are vulnerable to accidental movement.
Wait, really? Accidental movement of the fuel shutoff switch?
Yes. Say a pilot is reaching across the console or drops a heavy clipboard, it is physically possible to inadvertently hit those switches.
That's insane.
So the investigators are running complex simulations. Were those switches moved intentionally by a pilot suffering a medical episode? Were they bumped accidentally during a turbulent climb-out? Or, most concerning to the global fleet, did an unprecedented cascading electrical fault command the computers to cut the fuel without any human input whatsoever?
If we connect this to the broader reality for the listener, Air India still operates a massive fleet of over 40 of these Dreamliners. A listener might literally be boarding one tomorrow. Why hasn't a fleet been grounded while we wait for the September 2026 report?
It is a question of proven mechanical defect versus procedural error. Think back to the Boeing 737 MAX crisis.
Right, where the planes were grounded worldwide.
Exactly. Once investigators definitively proved that a specific software system, the MCS, was forcing the planes into dives, the global grounding was immediate. In the case of AI-171, if the NTSB and AAIB had found early evidence of a systemic computer glitch shutting off fuel, those planes would not be in the air right now.
Okay.
But because the failure mode is still heavily suspected to involve the physical switches on the console, meaning a potential human-machine interface issue, or a procedural error, the planes remain in service while airlines issue extreme cautionary directives to pilots regarding cockpit discipline around that center console.
Wow. From investigating technical design flaws in the sky, we turn to investigating deep historical fault lines right under our feet, because the complexity of governing resources is just staggering. In June 2026, the state governments of Assam and Nagaland signed a Memorandum of Understanding.
A very controversial one.
Extremely. The goal is to allow Oil India Limited, or OIL, to conduct joint oil and gas exploration along their border. Now, this border is violently contested. Imagine a multi-generational estate dispute where the original property lines were drawn by an absentee landlord decades ago. The current families have literally shed blood over this boundary.
Yes, it's a very tense area.
Suddenly, the two patriarchs of the family sign a contract to allow a massive mining corporation to drill for gold right on the contested property line, promising to split the profits. But there's a catch. The original inhabitants, the younger generations living on that exact plot of land, are saying, wait, this is our ancestral soil, and neither of you have the right to sign it away.
That is exactly the right way to visualize it. The historical weight of that border cannot be overstated. You have two state machineries attempting to forge macroeconomic cooperation, but they are operating over a foundational layer of deep, unresolved ethnic and customary claims.
Who is leading the opposition?
The fierce opposition is coming from Naga apex bodies, most notably the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, the NSCN-IM faction. Their argument is fundamental. This territory, regardless of where New Delhi draws the administrative lines, is Naga ancestral land.
So they reject the state's authority to make the deal entirely.
Completely. They view the MOU as an extractive maneuver by the state governments to siphon off Naga resources without achieving the free, prior, and informed consent of the Naga people.
And they are backing up that argument with international normative frameworks, right? They aren't just making a historical plea.
No, they're citing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Specifically, UNDRP Article 32.
Article 32, what does that cover?
This mechanism is crucial. Article 32 asserts that indigenous populations have the fundamental right to determine and develop priorities for their lands. It requires states to obtain consent prior to approving any project affecting their territories, especially regarding the extraction of minerals or other resources.
But does that hold up in an Indian court?
From a strict legal standpoint, UNDRP is not a binding treaty in the Supreme Court of India, but diplomatically and normative, it provides immense legitimacy to the NSCN-IM's resistance.
And the history of this border is a history of violence. We're talking about disputes stemming from the 1963 state reorganization order that carved Nagaland out of Assam. Assam relies on those constitutional boundaries.
And the Nagas rely on centuries of customary rights and ethnographic realities.
Right. We saw deadly clashes at Maripani in 2014. The Supreme Court has been attempting to mediate this for decades. So moving heavy industrial drilling equipment into a zone with that kind of historical trauma is incredibly volatile.
It directly threatens the broader geopolitical stability of the Northeast. The NSCN-IM signed a framework agreement with the Government of India in August 2015, aiming for a final peace settlement.
But that settlement is stalled, right?
It is paralyzed. Because the NSCNIM's core demand includes a separate Naga flag and constitution concessions, the government of India views as absolute red lines. When the NSCNIM witnesses this oil exploration MOU advancing, they perceive it as an attempt to establish irreversible economic facts on the ground before a political settlement is finalized.
So it just breeds more mistrust.
It reinforces their mistrust and hardens their negotiating stance.
But wait, if we zoom out, we have domestic groups arguing over who holds the legal right to extract and transport resources. It perfectly mirrors the international stalemate we talked about earlier in the Strait of Hormuz.
It really does. It's the same fundamental issue of sovereignty versus commerce.
Let's look at the legalities of blockades. An incredibly insightful Hindu op-ed recently analyzed the legal paradox of the U.S.-Iran standoff. The United States is loudly demanding that Iran open the international strait to commercial shipping, citing international law.
Right.
Yet simultaneously, the United States refuses to lift its own crushing naval blockade of Iranian ports. Here's where it gets really interesting. How can one country legally blockade an entire nation's ports, but then cry foul when that nation disrupts an international strait? Isn't international law supposed to prevent this kind of stalemate?
This raises an important question, and to analyze this impartially, we have to recognize that international maritime law during conflicts is riddled with competing frameworks. The primary framework here is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS.
UNCLOS, right.
Specifically, Article 87, which enshrines the freedom of the high seas, and Part 3, which details the Straits regime guaranteeing transit passage for all ships. Both the United States and Iran are leveraging different interpretations of international law to accuse the other of egregious violations.
Let's lay out the legal arguments objectively. How does the U.S. justify maintaining a blockade while demanding an open strait?
The American legal architecture relies on the concept of lawful countermeasures in armed conflict. They argue that their naval blockade is a proportional military response to Iranian belligerence.
What kind of belligerence?
The U.S. points to Iranian forces mining international waters, physically harassing neutral commercial tankers, and explicitly threatening to levy tolls on ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. From the U.S. perspective, Iran completely obliterated the UNCLOS guarantees of transit passage first.
So they argue Iran broke the rules first.
Exactly. Therefore, a naval blockade is framed not as unprovoked economic warfare, but as a legitimate, targeted military tool designed to force a belligerent state into compliance and restore the safety of international shipping lanes.
So the U.S. argues the blockade is the cure for Iran's disruption. How does Iran legally counter that?
Iran views the timeline completely differently. Their position is that the United States escalated this into a full-blown armed conflict with kinetic military strikes on Iranian territory back in February 2026.
Okay, so they say the U.S. shot first.
Right. Consequently, Iran argues that the U.S. naval blockade cannot be viewed merely as a military maneuver. It is a total, comprehensive economic strangulation. By preventing all civilian exports and imports, Iran claims the U.S. is inflicting massive, indiscriminate suffering on the civilian population.
Which violates humanitarian law.
Exactly. They argue this is a severe violation of international humanitarian law, IHL, which strictly limits the impact of warfare on non-combatants. Iran's stance is essentially pragmatic leverage. They maintain they will cease disrupting the Strait of Hormuz the exact moment the U.S. lifts the economic chokehold on their ports. Surrendering their control of the strait would mean giving up their only point of leverage while their economy dies.
It is the ultimate geopolitical Mexican standoff. Neither side can afford to be the first to lower their weapon. How does a stalemate like this actually get broken?
It requires a highly calibrated diplomatic mechanism, which Oman is currently trying to engineer. Oman acts as the primary back-channel mediator and has proposed a framework of simultaneous rollback.
Simultaneous rollback. What does that look like in practice?
This mechanism requires both parties to take verifiable, synchronized steps to de-escalate, monitored by a neutral third party. For instance, the U.S. might issue a specific humanitarian waiver allowing food and medicine to dock at an Iranian port, and in that exact same hour, Iran allows a designated convoy of tankers to transit Hormuz without harassment.
And India is aggressively championing this mechanism.
India has formally endorsed the Omani simultaneous rollback strategy because the status quo is financially bleeding them. As we noted, every single day this legal and military gridlock continues. It costs the Indian economy an estimated 400 to 500 crore rupees in excess energy and insurance premiums.
That's just unsustainable.
It is. India's primary concern isn't settling the legal debate over UNCLOS versus IHL. New Delhi's imperative is securing the physical flow of hydrocarbons.
Which highlights a terrifying reality. We are utterly dependent on these fragile external supply chains. But what happens when the gridlock isn't in the Middle East, but right here at home?
That's a great transition.
Let's talk about coal. We're moving from international energy stalemates to domestic ones. We are looking at the massive proposal to implement coal exchanges in India. To put this in perspective, India's hunger for energy is exponential. During the brutal 48 degrees Celsius heat wave in May of 2026, the country's peak power demand shattered records, crossing 250 gigawatts.
A massive milestone.
And to feed that grid, we are overwhelmingly reliant on burning coal. Right now, our domestic coal distribution system operates largely like a command economy cafeteria. You get what you're served when you're served. You have very little choice. The proposal for a coal exchange aims to turn that rigid system into a giant food delivery app where a power plant can buy the exact grade of coal it needs, exactly when it needs it, based on transparent real-time pricing.
The contrast between those two systems reveals the deep inefficiencies currently plaguing our power sector. The irony of India's coal crisis is that it is rarely a problem of absolute scarcity. India produces roughly 1 billion tons of coal annually.
1 billion tons.
Yeah.
So we have the coal.
We have the coal. The crisis is fundamentally a problem of geographical mismatch and rigid bureaucratic allocation. Nature deposited the vast majority of our coal reserves in the eastern states, Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh. Yet the explosive industrial and residential power demand is concentrated in the southwest and north.
So how does a power plant in, say, Gujarat or Tamil Nadu currently secure its fuel from Odisha?
It relies almost entirely on the state-owned behemoth Coal India Limited, CIL, which controls roughly 84% of the country's production.
A near monopoly.
A massive monopoly. The mechanism for distribution is the Fuel Supply Agreement, or FSA. These are rigid, long-term, multi-year contracts. If a power plant in Tamil Nadu suddenly experiences a massive, unexpected spike in electricity demand because of a sustained heat wave, they cannot simply log onto a terminal and purchase an extra 10,000 tons of coal for immediate delivery.
They are stuck.
They are shackled to their long-term FSA and the incredibly complex, heavily congested Indian Railways rake allocation system. Because the fuel cannot be dynamically routed to where the market is signaling the highest demand, you see rolling blackouts in coal-poor states, even while coal sits stockpiled at mines in the east.
So explain the actual mechanism of a coal exchange. How does it fix this rigidity?
A coal exchange would function much like a stock market, or the multi-commodity exchange for metals. It creates a centralized trading platform where buyers and sellers transact transparently in real time. It takes massive inspiration from the successful Indian Energy Exchange, the IEX, which revolutionized how electricity itself is traded in India.
Okay, so you can just buy what you need.
Right. With the coal exchange, you introduce two vital mechanisms: spot markets and futures markets. In a spot market, a power plant facing a sudden shortage could instantly purchase coal from a commercial mining company for immediate short-term delivery, bypassing the rigid FSA bureaucracy entirely.
That sounds great for emergencies. And the futures market.
A futures market would allow them to hedge their risks by locking in coal prices for delivery 6 months down the line.
The market theory sounds incredibly
If a plant buys coal on the exchange, but Indian Railways cannot allocate the physical rakes, the train wagons to transport it, the digital trade is useless. Furthermore, standardizing coal for trading is chemically complex. It is a highly heterogeneous commodity.
meaning not all coal is the same.
Exactly. Its gross calorific value, which measures its actual energy output, and its ash content vary wildly, not just from region to region, but from mine to mine. Creating standardized, universally accepted trading contracts for a product with such variable quality requires a massive leap in independent, third-party quality testing infrastructure at the mines themselves.
We are seeing a common theme here, moving from rigid, centralized allocations of physical resources to dynamic, decentralized systems. And fascinatingly, this exact same philosophy is currently rewriting how the government allocates human labor.
Yes, a massive shift.
We are witnessing a monumental shift taking place on July 1st, 2026. The Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, MGNRUGA, is officially being replaced by the Viksit Bharat Guarantee for Rozgar and Ajivika Mission Gramin Act, or VBG-RAMG.
Quite the acronym.
Yeah. So what did this all mean for the listener? They changed the acronym, they bumped the guarantee workdays from 100 to 125. But if you look under the hood, the underlying mechanics of how a rural worker actually secures a job have completely flipped. We need to look closely at this.
It is arguably the most profound structural alteration to India's social safety net in 2 decades. To analyze this impartially, we must focus strictly on the economic architecture of the 2 acts, separating the policy mechanics from the political rhetoric. The core macroeconomic debate centers on whether a fundamental right to work is being transitioned from a legally enforceable guarantee into a centrally capped welfare program.
Let's break down that architecture. How did the old system, MGNREGA, function at its core?
The foundational architecture of MGNREGA was demand-driven. Section 3 of that act was incredibly powerful. It created a statutory legal right. If any adult in a rural household stepped forward and demanded manual work, the government was legally obligated to provide that work within 15 days.
And if they couldn't find work for them?
If the government failed to generate the work, the center was legally mandated to pay an unemployment allowance. This wasn't just policy. A citizen could literally take the state to court to enforce this right. Because it was driven by citizen demand, the central budget for MGNREGA was theoretically open-ended.
Wow, so the budget just expanded to meet the demand. And how does the new architecture of VBG-RAMG alter that dynamic?
The new act completely reverses the flow. It is fundamentally supply-driven. Under VBG-RAMG, the central government will utilize predictive modeling to determine a normative allocation, essentially a preset budget and a capped number of total workdays assigned to each state at the beginning of the financial year.
Okay, so the center decides beforehand how much work is needed. But what if their model is wrong? Consider what happens if the actual demand for work in a state exceeds that central allocation.
The legal and financial burden shifts entirely to the state government. The state must generate the extra work from its own treasury or pay the unemployment allowance itself. Furthermore, even within the centrally allocated days, the new act mandates that states must now bear 40% of the wage and material costs.
Wait, 40%? Under the old system, who paid the wages?
Under the old system, the center bore essentially 100% of the wage costs.
That's a staggering transfer of financial responsibility onto the states. I can see why development economists are up in arms debating this.
The debate hinges on the concept of economic cyclicity. Prominent economists, such as Jean Drèze, have heavily criticized this shift, arguing it undermines the very purpose of a safety net. MGNREGA was explicitly designed to be a counter-cyclical stabilizer.
What does that mean in practice, counter-cyclical?
Let's visualize a severe drought year in a state with low fiscal capacity, like Bihar. The monsoon fails, the crops wither, and the private agricultural jobs completely vanish. Suddenly, millions of desperate agricultural laborers demand MGNREGA work just to feed their families. Because the old system was demand-driven, the center's spending would automatically surge to absorb that localized crisis, injecting money directly into the distressed rural economy. Drèze argues that VBG-RAMG, with its central caps and 40% state burden, is dangerously pro-cyclical.
Because the state runs out of money exactly when people need it most.
Precisely. When the drought hits, Bihar's own state revenues will collapse. They simply won't have the funds to cover their 40% share, let alone pay for the excess demand. The fear is that states will be financially incentivized to artificially suppress demand, turning away genuine job seekers at the exact moment the population needs the safety net the most.
But looking at the policy objectively, the government isn't just implementing this to cut costs. There are substantial, tangible upgrades built into this new act.
Absolutely. The policy design includes significant modernization efforts. Bumping the ceiling to 125 days provides a demonstrably higher potential income for the households that rely heavily on this labor.
That's a 25% increase in guaranteed days.
Yes. The new act also mandates a strict focus on durable infrastructure, investing the labor into permanent water conservation structures and climate-resilient assets. This directly addresses the long-standing critique that MGNREGA frequently paid workers to dig ditches and fill them back in without creating lasting economic value.
That was a huge criticism for years.
Furthermore, the Act enforces rigorous technological mandates like localized digital attendance and geotagging, specifically engineered to eradicate the massive corruption of ghost workers siphoning funds. And from a pure fiscal standpoint, the center has allocated over 95,692 crore rupees for this in the FY 26-27 budget, making it the largest upfront allocation for rural employment in history.
So it's a massive attempt to force productivity and accountability into the system, even as it fundamentally alters the nature of the legal guarantee.
Exactly. It's a trade-off between open-ended rights and centralized efficiency.
It is a massive internal rewiring of the country's grassroots economy. But while India is structurally reforming its domestic policies, it is simultaneously projecting an unprecedented level of power on the global stage. Let's follow the PM to Europe.
The France trip.
Yeah. The Prime Minister is on a strategic tour from June 13th to the 19th, covering bilateral talks in France, the G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains, and the Vivatech Festival in Paris. Before we look at the deals on the table, we really have to look at the historical bedrock of this specific relationship.
That's a very unique partnership.
It really is. You go back to 1998, Pokhran II, India conducts sovereign nuclear tests. The global community, led forcefully by the United States, slapped massive, crippling economic and technological sanctions on India. But France didn't blink. They refused to join the sanctions regime. That's the kind of geopolitical trust you can't buy. You have to earn it in the fire.
That specific historical moment is the DNA of the India-France Special Global Strategic Partnership. France places immense value on its own strategic autonomy. We must remember that France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command for decades, specifically to maintain its independent foreign policy.
Right.
Because they value their own sovereignty so highly, they deeply respect India's identical desire for a multi-aligned, independent path. They share remarkably similar threat perceptions regarding the dangers of a unipolar world, regardless of whether that pole is Washington or Beijing.
So they see eye to eye on the big picture.
This unique foundation of mutual respect allows for incredibly sensitive defense and technological negotiations that simply would not be viable with other Western partners who demand stricter alignment.
Let's talk about the defense pillar, because there is a monumental deal being negotiated right now.
The defense portfolio is absolutely headlining the visit. The Indian Air Force currently operates 36 French Rafale fighters, but the current negotiation falls under the massive Medium Role Fighter Aircraft Program, the MRFA. India is seeking to acquire 114 additional Rafale Marine fighters.
114? That's a massive scale up.
It represents a staggering 60,000 to 70,000 crore rupee capital outlay. But what elevates this beyond a simple buyer-seller transaction is the mechanism of technology transfer, or TOT. France is showing a willingness to share deep manufacturing intellectual property, agreeing to comprehensive Make in India integration through Hindustan Aeronautics Limited.
So we aren't just buying them, we're building them.
And crucially, they are permitting India to integrate its own indigenous weapon systems, like the BrahMos supersonic cruise missile and the Astra air-to-air missile, directly onto the French source code of the jets.
Oh, wow. Permitting a foreign nation to crack open your premier fighter's software architecture to integrate their own missiles requires an absolute zenith of geopolitical trust.
It does. It shows the depth of the partnership.
We see that trust in defense, but what about the civilian energy sector? The massive Jaipur nuclear project has been discussed for what feels like a generation.
It has been officially stalled since 2010. The vision was to construct 6 massive European pressurized reactors, EPRs, in Maharashtra, creating the single largest nuclear power park on the planet.
So why the delay?
The entire project hit a legal brick wall over the issue of civil liability. India passed the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act in 2010. A unique clause in that law gives the operator of the plant the right to pursue financial recourse directly against the foreign supplier of the reactor in the event of an accident.
So if something goes wrong, the French company pays.
Exactly. The French state-owned energy company, EDF, analyzed that sweeping liability and essentially walked away, finding the financial risks uninsurable. The mechanism the Prime Minister is pursuing on this trip is a potential government-to-government, or G2G, arrangement.
Meaning the governments take on the risk.
Yes. This mechanism attempts to effectively ring-fence the liability issue at the sovereign level, providing state-backed indemnification to bypass the commercial deadlock.
And beyond defense and nuclear power, there's a fascinating soft power play happening in Paris.
Yes.
India is the designated AI country partner at the Vivatech Festival.
It is a highly calculated projection of technological leadership. India is not merely attending a tech conference. They are actively presenting the MANA framework, the Multinational AI Governance for Accountability and Values.
MAFV.
This is India staking a claim in the...
Let's look at the Supreme Court task force findings on student suicides. We are talking about the agonizing loss of 13,000 to 14,000 young students to suicide every single year in this country. The crisis is heavily concentrated in hyper-competitive coaching hubs like CODA.
It is a tragic reality.
The Supreme Court recognized the gravity of this and constituted a national task force chaired by Dr. K.S. Radhakrishnan, which just submitted its comprehensive report. It's so easy to just say, we need more counselors. But the NTF report says that's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Putting suicide nets on ceiling fans in Kota hostels doesn't fix why the student is in despair in the first place.
It is arguably the most profoundly sobering topic we cover, and it requires rigorous, objective analysis of the societal structures involved. The most significant intellectual shift in the NTF report is its explicit rejection of framing this crisis purely through the lens of individual mental health.
Why reject that framing?
When society labels this solely a mental health crisis, it individualizes the blame. It subtly implies there is a chemical deficiency in the student's brain or a lack of personal resilience. The taskforce argues the exact opposite. These suicides are not individual failures. They are the tragic, predictable symptoms of a deeply toxic macrostructural environment. The report isolated 5 specific structural mechanisms driving this despair.
Let's break those down. What is the foundational mechanism they identified?
The foundational mechanism is hyper-competitive, single-examination gatekeeping. We have engineered an educational architecture that funnels millions of young people through incredibly narrow, high-stakes gateways like the NEET for medicine or the JE for engineering.
Right.
Look at the sheer mathematics of the NEET exam in 2026. You have approximately 25 lakh students engaging in gladiatorial combat for roughly 1.1 lakh available MBBS seats. The odds of success are less than 5%. A single exam taken on a single day permanently dictates an individual's lifetime socioeconomic trajectory. The sheer, crushing existential weight of that bottleneck is unimaginable.
And that bottleneck gave birth to the second mechanism, the coaching industry itself. Why has society simply accepted this parallel education system?
Society accepts it out of sheer desperation. The NTF report casts a glaring light on the unregulated 65,000 crore rupee coaching industry. This industry operates purely on the capitalization of anxiety.
It's massive business.
Huge. They charge exorbitant fees, frequently forcing rural or lower middle-class families into severe generational debt. To justify those staggering costs, the institutes mandate extreme, unsustainable academic regimens demanding 12 to 16 hours of study a day. But the most insidious mechanism is their psychological methodology.
Oh, so?
They actively utilize fear-based marketing and constant humiliating public comparison as motivational tools. They have industrially manufactured a cultural narrative where failing to clear the entrance exam is framed not as a standard academic setback, but as a total, irredeemable, personal and familial disgrace.
Which leads directly into the third mechanism, the sociology of the family unit, extreme parental and social pressure.
Precisely. Because the family unit is liquidating life savings or taking predatory loans to fund this coaching, the entirety of that financial and emotional risk lands squarely on the shoulders of the teenager. The report made a profound sociological observation regarding first-generation aspirants.
Those carrying the hopes of the whole family.
Yes. These are students tasked with the responsibility of securing a prestigious degree to lift their entire extended family out of historical poverty. The psychological vulnerability of carrying that specific burden is immense.
And what happens to the 95% of students who mathematically cannot get that seat? That's the fourth structural failure, right?
The absolute absence of dignified alternative pathways. If a student fails to crack NEET or G, India's current credentialing structure offers very few respected, economically viable alternatives. This societal tunnel vision creates an absolute binary. You either succeed and are revered, or you fail and are cast out. There is no psychological safety net for failure.
And finally, the physical environment where all of this psychological pressure cooker is taking place.
The toxic institutional infrastructure. We are extracting teenagers from their familial support systems during their most vulnerable developmental years and dropping them into highly unregulated hostels in these coaching factory towns. They endure poor nutrition, chronic sleep deprivation, and extreme social isolation. It creates an ecosystem completely devoid of emotional safety.
So what concrete mechanisms does the task force actually recommend to dismantle this architecture?
The recommendations demand sweeping structural reform. They advocate for strict statutory regulation of the coaching institutes, specifically banning the psychological manipulation of fear-based marketing and legally prohibiting the public display of student rankings to eliminate the culture of shaming.
That would be a huge cultural shift.
It would. Systemically, they recommend designing multiple examination pathways, perhaps a mechanism that heavily weights sustained board marks alongside entrance scores, or allowing multiple attempts throughout the year to relieve the one-shot pressure. And vitally, they propose mandatory, structured peer support groups.
Why peers instead of professionals?
Professional counselors often carry an unfair stigma, but trained student peers living in the same hostels are positioned to recognize the early behavioral signs of a classmate withdrawing or failing to sleep, allowing for intervention before the despair becomes terminal.
It is an incredibly heavy reality to confront. Let's take a breath. Acknowledge the immense unfair burden placed on our youth trying to secure their futures and smoothly pivot to how the nation is attempting to secure its macroeconomic future. Let's revisit the Northeast.
Right. Back to Assam and Nagaland.
We talked about the political friction of this MOU earlier, but why are Assam and Nagaland willing to endure that friction? What is the prize? We're circling back to topic 3, but now looking through the lens of pure macroeconomics and energy security.
To understand the prize, we simply have to connect the dots back to our very first topic. Remember the escalating conflict in the Strait of Hormuz.
The $115 a barrel crude.
Exactly. The Indian economy is currently bleeding foreign exchange. That extreme, paralyzing geopolitical vulnerability is exactly why the geological formations buried under the Patkai Hills and the Upper Assam Basin are suddenly so vital.
Let's look at the geology and the math. How much hydrocarbon potential does the Northeast actually hold?
Currently, the Northeast produces about 6 million metric tons of crude annually. That accounts for roughly 14 to 15% of India's total domestic production. However, those known legacy reserves are actively depleting. But advanced seismic surveys indicate that the violently contested border belt holds significant, entirely untapped hydrocarbon reserves.
And that changes the math completely.
In the context of the Hormuz crisis, every single barrel of Oil India Limited can pull out of the ground in Assam or Nagaland is a barrel we do not have to purchase from the Middle East and ship through a militarized blockade. The macroeconomic math is undeniable. For every 1 million metric tons of new domestic crude we produce, the Indian exchequer saves between 8,000 and 9,000 crore rupees in imports.
Saving nearly 9,000 crore rupees explains the political motivation perfectly. But executing the extraction in that specific physical location must be a logistical nightmare.
It is arguably one of the most operationally hostile environments for resource extraction on the globe. Before you even strike ground, you have the bureaucratic and environmental labyrinth. Navigating the strict Forest Conservation Act to legally clear land for massive drilling rigs in dense tropical forests is incredibly slow.
And then there's the terrain.
Right, building pipelines from scratch in difficult mountainous terrain subject to extreme monsoons. And finally, you have the severe security apparatus required. We discussed the armed opposition from groups like the NSCNIM. To protect the personnel and the rigs from insurgent threats, they will have to deploy heavily armed battalions of the Central Industrial Security Force, the CISF, just to maintain daily operations.
The economic reward for the nation is massive, but the physical, environmental, and security costs are staggering. Extracting fossil fuels is one way to secure the economy, but optimizing how we grow our food is the other.
That brings us to our final topic.
Let's look at the literal grassroots. The government is planning to slash the approval time for specialty fertilizers from 3 to 7 years down to 18 months. Right now, our farmers are stuck using rotary phones while the rest of the world has smartphones, simply because the government takes 7 years to approve the smartphone.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the inefficiency. To understand why this regulatory reform is so desperately needed, we have to look closely at the underlying chemistry of farming and the heavily distorted economics of how we subsidize it. The primary administrative bottleneck is an archaic piece of legislation called the Fertilizer Control Order of 1985.
The FCO. Why does it take so long?
Under this rigid framework, if a tech company invents a brilliant new fertilizer, they are legally mandated to run exhaustive field trials across multiple distinct Kharif and Rabi growing seasons, stretching the approval process out for years. As a result, Indian agriculture remains heavily reliant on conventional granular urea.
Let's explain the chemistry there. Why is conventional urea considered so inefficient compared to the new technology?
The core issue is the fundamental instability of nitrogen in the environment. When a farmer broadcasts massive quantities of conventional urea across a field, the crop only absorbs a fraction of it. India wastes approximately 50% of the applied nitrogen.
Half of it is just wasted.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is lost through two main chemical processes. The first is leaching. The nitrogen dissolves in irrigation water and washes deep into the soil, permanently contaminating the groundwater with dangerous nitrates. The second process is volatilization, where the urea breaks down on the surface of the soil and simply evaporates into the atmosphere as ammonia gas.
That sounds terrible for the environment.
It is, But there are incredible technological leaps waiting for regulatory clearance. Take nanourea, developed indigenously by IMFCO. A tiny 500 milliliter bottle replaces a massive, back-breaking 50-kilogram sack of conventional urea. Because the nitrogen is engineered into nanoparticles and sprayed directly onto the leaves of the plant, it reduces nitrogen loss by an incredible 80%.
Wow. And there are others.
You also have slow-release fertilizers, SRFs, coated in polymers that feed the plant gradually over months, and biostimulants designed to regenerate the biological health of the soil.
If these new technologies are so vastly superior, why aren't the farmers demanding them? Why do they keep buying the conventional urea?
Because they are trapped in a massive 2.5 lakh crore rupee economic distortion. The government heavily subsidizes conventional urea. Currently, a farmer pays only about 242 rupees for a bag of urea that actually costs the government over 600 rupees to procure on the global market.
Oh, so it's artificially cheap.
Exactly. Because it's dirt cheap, the economic incentive for the farmer is to over-apply it massively. They dump it on their fields, which slowly destroys the natural pH balance of the soil, poisons the local water table, and perversely actually lowers long-term crop yields. The new specialty fertilizers are not subsidized under the same heavy mechanisms. So to a poor farmer, the advanced fertilizer looks prohibitively expensive.
So what specific mechanisms is the government proposing to fix this broken market?
The reform strategy tackles both the bureaucracy and the economics. First, they are aggressively slashing the approval time under the FCO down to 18 months. Second, they are actively restructuring the economic incentives by proposing to extend the nutrient-based subsidy, the NBS framework, to cover these new specialty fertilizers.
Making them affordable.
And leveraging schemes like PM Pranam, which financially rewards state governments that successfully reduce their overall consumption of conventional chemical fertilizers. I would ask the listener to consider how this directly affects the nutritional value of the food on their dinner plate tonight. The efficiency of the fertilizer directly dictates the micronutrient uptake of the growing crop.
It all comes back to the dinner plate. The macro always finds its way to the micro. And that is a perfect place to synthesize everything we have navigated today. We have woven a thread through 10 incredibly dense, complex topics.
It's been quite a journey.
From asserting our rights in the Strait of Hormuz, to overhauling how we buy coal, employ our rural citizens, protect our students, and fertilize our soil. India is in a massive phase of structural rewiring.
It is the reality of a nation simultaneously attempting to secure its position in a highly unstable global geopolitical order, while comprehensively renovating its own foundational domestic architecture.
It's huge. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder as you step back into your day. If you look closely at the shift in the Rural Employment Act, VBG-RAM-G, forcing states to pay 40% of wages, and Assam and Nagaland directly negotiating oil rights, we are seeing a quiet but massive transfer of financial burden and resource management from the center to the state governments. As the world gets more globalized, is our actual day-to-day survival becoming hyper-regionalized? Who really holds the keys to your future? The diplomats in New Delhi or your local state assembly?
That is a very provocative question to end on.
We know the landscape of global affairs is murky and constantly shifting, but hopefully today we've helped clear the fog just a little bit. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for those hidden connections, and we'll see you next time.